Old iMacs. They're pretty much being thrown out everywhere these days. This is probably almost 14 years old as far as I'm aware. Does it work? I have never actually powered it on, so I don't actually know. It came from an e-waste bin at a private school. Let's power it up and give it a much needed cleaning because it is filthy.
When one of the air intakes looks like this, you know you're in for a good time. And I must admit, it's been a while since I've covered anything Apple related. But don't worry, there's plenty more planned for later this year. The Mac we're looking at here is one of the chunky, pre-tapered edge ones featuring an optical drive and a side-mounted SD card slot. But most importantly, does it show any signs of life? And those speakers are definitely working, that's for sure. It appears at the very least it turns on, getting some way through the boot process before inevitably failing for some reason. But that's totally fine, and I'm sure we can work with what we've got here. But first, I'll give it a quick clean off, since it's so damn filthy. And underneath the dust and grime, the display glass is surprisingly good. Using some eucalyptus oil, I wipe down the surfaces. Some areas are unsurprisingly more grubby than others, the power button being a place students would often touch. And I would imagine they also frequently grabbed the other side of the Mac, forgetting which side the power button was on. And I must say, back when I was in high school, I definitely did that many times as well. One of the best attributes of having an aluminium casing is just how easy it is to clean off. To test it further, I'll simply install a random version of Mac OS. I wasn't exactly sure which model of Mac this was, so 10.11 El Capitan is a safe bet. I was able to wipe the 500GB mechanical hard disk, which is likely the original drive, and began the installation. Sometime later, it was finally up and running, and now we can see exactly what this Mac is. Oh, it's a Core 2 Duo 2009 model, which isn't exactly an amazing thing, especially by today's standards. But it is working and ripe for a drive as well as a RAM upgrade. And before taking it apart, I made sure to note exactly which model this is. EMC 2308, which I easily found a tutorial for on iFixit's website. We'll definitely want to take note of all the screw locations and be prepared, as this is a time-consuming disassembly. First, we'll remove the RAM cover door on the base. And wow, it had a nice carpet forming in there. If only there was a way to know exactly how many hours of use this iMac has seen. Oh, and be sure to take the RAM out. The tutorial doesn't mention that, but you definitely need to if you plan on removing the logic board. And unlike newer iMacs, the glass here is only held on with magnets. They're very strong though. Do not underestimate the power of magnetism. And be sure to gently lift the glass away from the fragile display surface. You do not want to scratch it. Those magnets can also make screw removal somewhat of a challenge. There are several that hold the screen in place, and I found a pair of pliers did help with getting some of the screws out. And with all of them removed, the display can now be lifted from the top, but don't open it up too far yet, as there are several display cables to unclip. These may differ depending on your specific model, so be careful. Next, we've got the LED backlight, the fragile display connector, which has latches on either side that must be released. And last of all, there is this little wire that I believe runs to a temperature sensor. And now the whole display panel can be lifted up and out of the casing. These display panels are very fragile and also quite expensive to buy, so definitely take care of it. And here are the dusty internals of the 15-year-old Mac. From afar, it honestly doesn't look too bad, but it is caked with dust and debris since there is a huge amount of airflow. The tutorial mentioned removing the power supply, but this isn't actually necessary to gain access to the processor.
If you're ever opening up an old iMac yourself, be sure not to touch the exposed circuitry of the power supply. And speaking of circuit boards, if you're someone that wants to have your own PCB designs created or even made from scratch, check out today's sponsor, Psivewri. What they do isn't just limited to rigid and flexible PCBs, they also do CNC machining and 3D printing. With a fast turnaround, great value, and worldwide shipping, there's no better time than now to turn your plans into reality. So whether you need a small batch of boards made for prototyping or even thousands of boards fully assembled, make your way to Psivewri using the link below.
Before I take it apart further, I thought a light dusting was in order, and I'll be honest, I was dreading taking the logic board out since there are so many connectors attached to it. And apart from the display panels being taped on, newer iMacs are a lot simpler when it comes to the internals. The first of the fans is used to cool the graphics processor as well as the optical disk drive, and using my anti-static brush, I removed most of the dust. If you ever follow a tutorial, I'd recommend reading the comments made by other users. They said it was a good idea to mark one of the speaker connectors so you know which is which, although they do have slightly different connectors looking back at this footage. Definitely pay close attention to how these connectors attach as well. This is one of the few that lifts up vertically from the board. As the years went on, I must say that iMacs became a whole lot neater inside, and whatever you do, don't yank out the wires themselves. A plastic pry tool makes it much easier to dislodge the stubborn ones, and some iMac models will even have an IR sensor, which also has to come out to get access to the logic board. Being sure to note their locations, I took out the last Torx T10 screws. But we aren't quite done yet. These iMacs had a rather odd cooling solution for the graphics processor. This large, thin sheet of copper was used to dissipate the heat. It's held to the Mac's frame with some kind of silver tape that I ended up ripping slightly. And before I finally lift out the mainboard, I decided to tape down the sprawling mess of connectors. This will stop me from accidentally placing them underneath the logic board when I go to reassemble it. It was a snug fit, but with some wiggling, I finally got the board dislodged. A nice carpet had definitely been forming in that vent. And last of all are the SATA connectors and the large power plug on the underside. These can be a pain to disconnect, so take your time and do not force the connectors. And here we have the board in all its dusty glory. It isn't necessary to dust every little thing out, but since I've gone to all the effort of opening this up and I don't plan on doing it again, we might as well get it all out. And there's a good chance some of this dust would end up being spewed out of the air vents and into my room, which I'd rather avoid. And if your device is as dusty as this, I'd strongly advise wearing a mask or better yet dusting it outside. I thought I'd also replace the PRAM battery. This Mac has a BR2032, but I only have a CR2032 battery on hand. These are both 3 volts, but the BR2032 would likely have withstood temperatures better inside the Mac. Interestingly enough, the original battery still holds 3 volts, which is very impressive if it's 15 years old. Now it's time to get in deeper and redo that thermal paste. It seems as if it's never been opened before. To get the cooling system off, you've got to remove these 6 screws, which allows you to simply lift off the support bracket. That vintage paste has become quite hard. This wouldn't exactly have kept the processor all that cool, but it is very satisfying to see it come off in large chunks. Potential CPU upgrades are very limited. Either you put in a faster 3.33 GHz Core 2 Duo, or try and find a 65-watt Core 2 Quad, which may actually have some compatibility issues. If I'd known which model of iMac this was before I started filming, I could have sourced a slightly better processor, but sadly, the graphical processor in this iMac is not user replaceable, with its cooling block held on by these little plastic clips. The Geforce 9400 with an anemic 256 MB of video memory is a real bottleneck for gaming of any sorts. Later model iMacs, up until 2011, had removable MXM graphics cards, which meant upgrades were very much possible. There was an upgrade option for a better graphics processor for this Mac back in 2009, however the one in here doesn't even use dedicated video memory, meaning it's tapping into the much slower system RAM, and this fan is designed to cool the optical disk drive, but it also cools the graphical processor. It intakes its air through this very dusty vent on the base of the iMac. The other fan cools the main processor, and it also looks very much filled with dust. It's not as easy to remove this one, however, as there are a few cables mounted on its side, as well as a temperature sensor hooked onto the underside. I'll have to make sure I put all these cables back in and route them in the right places when I reassemble it. I can only imagine how much use this computer saw to get this dusty, and I'll be sure to brush all of that stuff out of these. I will also be upgrading the hard disk, but I couldn't see the point in also removing the other circuit boards. There are just so many wires and cables that I don't want to reinstall them in the wrong position. I also didn't bother removing the hard disk fan, I simply brushed it out as it was. The CPU fan definitely needed a good dusting, which I did outside to avoid getting too much debris floating in the air in my filming room. I bought a few tubes of Arctic MX4 recently, as it's a good value paste. With any luck, it'll keep the internals of this iMac nice and cool for many years to come. It is a shame that this logic board can't accept a first-gen i5 or even an i7 processor, which would vastly improve its multi-core potential. It is very fiddly getting the cooler back on, I must admit, and after putting in the screws that are on the back, I made sure that the spring tension screws on the top were significantly tight. Now the reassembly can finally begin. Taping down all of those connectors is an absolute must, and keeping track of all the screws really helped as well. I would absolutely hate to have to take the board out again just because I accidentally let a connector get stuck underneath, but somehow I did get the microphone cable in the wrong spot. Now it won't even reach the connector on the logic board, so I did did actually have to take out all the screws and reposition that cable. I honestly forgot just how much of a pain it is to work on this particular model of iMac. Now we've got another hurdle, replacing the hard disk which uses its own temperature sensor. I thought maybe I could just stick this little board in here with the temperature sensor still connected, but I think it actually needs power to do anything. You can buy a special solid-state drive adapter, but I simply used the original bracket, some glue, and a zip tie. This actually holds it in securely, but we still have to deal with that temperature sensor. Doing nothing and leaving it unplugged will mean the fan will run at full blast all of the time. But there is a trick that I read about, splicing the two sensor wires together. This will make the hard disk fan run at the lowest speed possible continuously, which honestly sounds like a pretty good compromise to me. After double checking that everything was back together, I gently seated the display. It's so annoying trying to reseat the display cables, so take your time. Fingers crossed, does it still work? Thankfully it does, and it seemed to detect the hard disk as well. I just chucked in a random SSD I had lying around, which apparently appears to have macOS already on it. It seems to boot up completely fine. Even the extra RAM is detected. I can also confirm that the hard disk fan is running at the lowest speed and the temperatures appear to be very cool so far. Now I can confidently put it back together properly, and before putting the glass back on, I made sure the surface was absolutely spotless. I did the same with the other side of the glass, as it would be rather hard to clean once back together. The little label on the front came off very easily. I'm pretty sure this was done with a label writer, and with the help of some eucalyptus oil, the rest of the residue came off with a few gentle wipes. This little Velcro thingy was a little bit more stubborn though, but it also came off, leaving some weird glue behind. I used a bit of isopropyl alcohol to soften it up, which did help. Now that's much better. It's now a much cleaner machine both inside and out. But what is this 15, almost 16-year-old Mac still good for? It is possible to get the latest version of macOS running on here with some basic patching, but I want to use old software that only runs on older versions. Just like this MacBook Pro, I do all of my photo editing and photoshopping on. For my use cases, it's very handy to keep an Apple computer or two with an older version of macOS. I want this machine to be able to run Adobe CS5 as well as Logic Pro 9, so macOS 10.12 Sierra is really as far as I can go. I made this installer USB a long time ago, and it appeared to still be working. With the SSD reformatted, I began the installation, but it doesn't seem to work, giving me this error message. And to get around this, turn off the Wi-Fi, then you'll want to open up the terminal. The problem is the date. It's too recent compared to the date the installer was made. A tutorial I found on YouTube suggested setting the date back to 2016, and this actually worked, and now it would install correctly. With a new profile picture taken, it was time to use this iMac. With Logic Pro 9 installed, I can record stuff and mess around with my keyboard. Maybe you'll recognize this song.
It was a dark and spooky Halloween night when I, Dracula, thought that I would invite all of my freaky friends who were there in the flash to a big dance party, a monster mash. Wolfman, Frankenstein and Mommy were there, while Medusa fed some mice to the snakes in her hair. It was a groovy good time for a vampire bat to fly out of his coffin and... Wait, what was that?
The 21.5-inch 1920 by 1080 display is also decent enough for Photoshop and editing pictures. Even though it only has 2 CPU cores, it performs well enough. Light gaming is also possible. The latest version of Minecraft does run at a playable frame rate with the performance-enhancing mod Optifine installed. 1080p YouTube playback is also fine on this Mac, even with an outdated browser and operating system, at least for now. It may be incredibly outdated by modern standards, but it's still an elegant computer with a design that really has stood the test of time, and for me, it's a Mac that will still serve a purpose for many more years to come.
Thank you very much for watching. Even though this Mac is quite outdated, that does not mean it's useless by any stretch of the imagination. I'll have more old tech videos out for you real soon, so stay tuned for more of those in the near future. Have a good one.